All right, so let's make a formal introduction for our listeners. Good afternoon, Richard. My name is Claudio. I'm calling you from Washington, D.C., from the studios in Fairfax City. We're very humble and grateful that Richard Macphail accepted our invitation to our show. Richard, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Same. I'm happy you're here, that we were able to connect. Phil, what was the first question? What was the motivation for writing the book, right? For people that don't know who you are and so forth.
Well, a few things. I retired in 2015, and from my work, and everyone always says when you retire, you need a project to keep you busy. So I thought, I've often thought, lots of people have said to me, you should write a book, because I thought there was a story there, and worth telling. And I also thought, inevitably, there's going to be a lot of people who would be interested in it, because of I don't know the numbers, but I believe that together and apart, Genesis have sold probably something like 400 million albums. So there's an awful lot of people out there who know and love the band and might be interested in what I had to say. So, but the other thing, with slightly tongue in cheek, is that on the first live album, Genesis Live, there was a dedication to me, and a lot of people thought that the dedication was saying that I was dead. And people have often met me over the years and said, but I thought Richard Macphail was dead. And so I thought it would be good to lay that rumor to rest and knock on wood. I'm still very much alive, and that was another reason to write the book.
Good for you, man. Good for you. I think on the other side of the band, I think it says in memory of Richard Macphail, and if you read in memory, in fact, this guy passed away or something,
It says who left.
Who left?
And and some people thought that was a euphemism for that I died. So there's all these people in the world who don't know who Richard Macphail is, but what they know is that he's dead. So I wanted to dispel that rumor.
Absolutely. Feel free to elaborate. Thank you very much. Feel free to elaborate on the earliest memory that you have from the Charterhouse. By the way, in the UK, in some other country, they will call that a public school. Here in the United States, we call that a private school.
Exactly.
And a private school can be boarding school, or can be your kids go in the morning and come back to home.
But it's a fee-paying school.
It's a fee-paying school, right?
Yeah, it was. That is the right name for it. It is a private school, but it's the history. It goes back a long way when actually they weren't fee-paying schools. They were public. Before there was, going back several centuries, but because Charterhouse was founded in London in 1611, and schools then were all run by the church. Generally it was the clergy who were the ones who could read and write and therefore educate people. And so they were public schools, but it is a misnomer. They're very private, and they're very expensive, and they're generally meant for the sort of, upper echelons of society who are going to go on. The idea was that you go to a school like Charterhouse, you get into Oxford or Cambridge, correct, and then you become a lawyer or a doctor and or a politician. Our current government has an inordinate number of people who went to various public schools, in particular Eton, Boris Johnson, etc. So the system still works that way, but you weren't meant to come out of that school and be in a rock band.
I have my personal feeling about sending kids to. I have my son just turned 19, and sending the kids to the boarding school. I have mixed feeling about it. I see good points and bad points about sending the kids away. I don't know but that's what people do. I'm not here to judge.
Well, no, personally, I don't approve of it. You go to a country like some of the Scandinavian countries, they just don't have private schools. Everybody goes into the school system, the public school system, and I think that they're better for it. But the other problem with the so-called public school system is that you don't just go to a public school when you're 13. You go to what's called a prep school. It stands for preparatory, to prepare you for public school when you're 8. And there's no doubt that sending an 8-year-old boy away to be looked after by people who don't love them is I think, an abomination, and it does enormous emotional damage. I don't know whether you heard my show where I had Tony Banks on my radio show, and Radio Rich Pickings, and we were talking about this, and he said there's no doubt that I was damaged emotionally being sent away that young. Yeah. Because suddenly you're in this strange place with all of these, and I mean, it's what went on there. I mean, a lot of them were of good intention, and the prep school I went to, I believe, was a good one. And after the initial shock of essentially being banished, sent away, not understanding at aged 8 what the hell was going on, and why was my mother crying when we got in the car to go away? What? So I was going, well, I thought I was meant to be the child and she the adult, and anyway. But the truth is, after I got used to it, I actually quite enjoyed it. But I know Tony didn't. He absolutely hated it. Yeah. And so, I mean, that's the problem. I recently read an incredibly good book called Sad Little Men, about very, very clearly and well laid out the damage that is done to young boys sent away at that age. And he particularly focuses, because he's the same age as them, on Boris Johnson and David Cameron, 2 of our recent prime ministers, and the problem with those people being sent away, being damaged, and then becoming bloody prime minister of a country is a problem for everybody.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. I wanted to ask you the question, but I didn't know how you will react, because I didn't know what was your position. That I'm very clear to me what I would. I think here, at least here in the United States, Richard, before we move to a different point, if you have good parents and schooling, education is important, you have the same chance to the top school in the country, whether you went to a boarding school or where you went to a public school and your parents were teaching you at home and stuff. They probably, the probabilities increase going to a public school in your case because the degree of difficulty is higher and so on and so forth, but it takes an emotional toll, right? That's what
I know people who went to private schools in America. There's one in Vermont called Putney School. And 2 good friends went there. But the thing about them is that they were at home until they were 13. And then they went. And, I think the damage is far less at that age.
Correct.
Because you can understand what's going on. And I know people in this country who didn't send their children to prep schools. They waited until the children were 12 and 13 and actually gave them the choice. And I know at least 2 young people who, when they got to that age, said, yes, I if you want to send me to this school, they're obviously incredibly well endowed, and the facilities are amazing, and the opportunities are amazing. And the young people actually chose to go to boarding schools, and enjoyed it and didn't regret it. So I think that's a much better way of doing it.
I understand. And in your life, you began playing. You were a drummer, and then.
No.
And then, I'm going.
I wasn't a drummer. Rufus Joe thought I was a drummer. God bless him. He turned out to be a man of tremendous clear vision and intelligence. But that afternoon, when he heard me drumming, I don't know what he thought, but thank God he did, because that's that. As you know, that's what led to him introducing me to Ant, and that was a life-changing. Both Rivers and Ant were responsible for in very important events and life-changing incidents in my early life. Yes. Yeah.
I had the opportunity to interview Anthony Phillips, affectionately known as Ant, and he was a very nice person too. What the first memory you have of Anthony Phillips? I read in the book that you thought that he was way ahead of everybody else at the time.
He was. Well, Rivers was too. Really? But yeah, I mean, I remember the day that Rivers told me about Eric Clapton. I guess we were probably 13. Yeah. And he said, "There's this guitarist who people are calling God." Turned out to be that Jeff Beck was really the God, but that's another story.
Oh yeah.
Rivers said, "Meet me at Marble Arch, and we'll get the bus down to Ant's house." And as you might expect, being public school boys. Ant's father was a merchant banker, so they were quite well off, and they had a big house in a suburb of southwest London called Putney. And Rivers and I went on the bus. Rivers had his bass guitar with him, and the contrast. What was my strongest memory of the day is that at this point. My parents were extremely worried about how my education was going, and they were right to be, because they were investing a lot of money in this education that they wanted me to have, and all I was interested in was music, and they didn't like or understand the music that I liked. So I get to Ant's house, so I go from my house where it's like this, the whole time, and my school reports getting worse and worse every time. And there's Ant's house where the dining room on the right of the front door, everything was cleared away, and that it had been turned into a rehearsal studio. And there was Ant's mother, grandmother, and aunt, who were just all over us and couldn't be encouraging enough. We must have been making a terrible noise, and they were going, "Oh, darlings, it sounds so wonderful," and then after a couple of hours of crashing around, they'd produce this wonderful lunch. And, that it was just like another world to me, where parents were encouraging of our efforts. And it was true later particularly of Mike Rutherford's parents. His father was a retired sea captain from the Navy, but his mother, just was unbelievably encouraging of our efforts, and it made a lot of difference. So that was the main thing, but also Ant's talent. Every time we mentioned a song, he just seemed to be able to play it, and clearly he was a deeply musical point. At this point, he hadn't started writing songs, and what we all loved the Stones, so we tended to do a lot of Stones covers. Excuse me. But it soon emerged that I was not the drummer that Rivers had hoped that I was, and wasn't slow just to say, "Listen, can you sing?"
Yeah.
And so my head was full of early Stones songs, so I started singing, and it all went from there. Turned out that Ant had a friend round the corner who was also at Charterhouse, Rob Tyrrell, who was an incredibly good drummer. Yeah. So with the addition of Mike on rhythm guitar, and when I talked to Mike about the early days, he said, when I first met Ant, I probably knew 3 chords, and Ant taught me everything I know about playing the guitar. So Ant was the giant of the musical scene at that time.
Well, that's a great story. Anthony, so it's fair to say that when Anthony Phillips and River Job formed the Anon. I think it's called Anon after that.
The name was my idea.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be, well, partly at Charterhouse, doing what we were doing was not appreciated by the faculty. You could do anything you wanted at Charterhouse. You could jump out of aeroplanes, you could make pots, you could swim, you could, play any sport, the facilities. But the thing we wanted to do was to be a band. And so as Mike actually later again described it, he said it was like a sort of musical underground. We got to know who was into doing music, and sort of we connected up, as I say, slightly as an underground. So the idea of us being anonymous, I thought, was a good name. So the name was Anon, like you get with a poem when they don't know who wrote the poem, or a folk song or something like that. It's just Anon. So unfortunately, nobody could cope with the idea of not having the definite article. So we became known as the Anon, and we've never been able to shake that off. So I suppose in that respect, probably wasn't a very good name, because it's no good if you have a name and people get it wrong all the time. So, but be that as it may, Anon is what we were.
And all of you were living in different houses or so how you were able to connect, and then there were equipment somewhere, a piano or somewhere? Or?
I mean, we again, you see, most of the equipment we had been bought by the parents. And I don't know where we had a very rudimentary PA for me to sing through, but Ant had a Fender Stratocaster. You couldn't ask for a better guitar. Rivers had a Fender bass, and so the instruments we had were good, but the rest of the stuff was pretty rubbishy, as it was, to be honest with you, right through to when Genesis got started. Our equipment was appalling. But anyway, that's so. But we knew that some of the teachers, the masters, were more sympathetic than others, and so we would ask them if we could use their classrooms on a Saturday afternoon, and we would get a trolley from the groundsman, the people who would prepare the cricket pitches and stuff for games, and load up the trolley with our gear, motley collection of gear, and wheel it out to wherever the classrooms were that we'd managed to secure to rehearse for a few hours on a Saturday afternoon. So that's how we did it.
I got it, perfect. And then you came into the picture, and after that, Rutherford joined the trio, right? Yeah. And
our drummer, Rob Tyrrell.
Rob Tyrrell.
So that was the band. We had the same lineup as the Stones: lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass, drums, and singer.
And then after that, you guys, then Peter came with Tony, right? I think Peter Gabriel was a friend of Tony Banks, and then Tony get into the new you guys?
Well, Peter, Tony, and Ant actually were all in the same house, so they knew each other well. And Peter and Tony, when there were break times, when they were allowed to play, there was a piano in their common room, which is interesting because there wasn't in my house. So why there was a piano there, I don't know, but it certainly made a big difference to the story. The two of them would race each other to get to the piano first, so they could start playing and improvising and early days of composing. But Ant was mostly focused on our group. But excuse me, I'm just going to get a glass of water.
Sure.
Okay. So
go ahead.
The summer of 1966 turned out to be the last term at Charterhouse for me and Rivers.
Yeah.
And because education wasn't going well, our parents decided to send us elsewhere, different schools. So Anon were left without a singer and a bass player.
Mm.
And funnily enough, Genesis never did get a bass player. And obviously Mike plays bass, and Daryl plays bass on when they play live. Mike plays bass pedals, but actually they never had a bass player, which is a funny thing. So, but Ant and Mike said to Peter, because Ant knew Peter could sing, "Do you want to join our group?" And he said, "I'll join if I can." No, I'm sorry, I'm getting the story wrong. They asked Tony Banks to come and join on piano.
Well,
and he said, if I can bring along my friend Peter, because he's turning into quite a good singer. So that's essentially how Genesis got started. Chris Stewart, the first drummer, was also in the same house as them. And so they asked him to play the drums, and they formed this group called the Garden Wall.
Right.
And that was the beginning of Genesis.
So the Anon, and then later on the Garden Wall are the genesis of Genesis.
Yeah, exactly. And Ant was in both bands.
I got it. Yeah, I think Anthony Phillips was thinking at the time, but I think I read in the book that when Ant talked to Tony, with Tony Banks, say, no, don't stop the singing. Just wait until my buddy Peter Gabriel, come to our meeting next Saturday or whatever it was, and that's okay, and then it would make a big difference, right? So
yeah,
well, amazing.
It did, yeah.
Amazing. Before I forget that, although I have my, my perhaps negative view about public school, private school here in the United States, if it wasn't for the Charterhouse, all those kids joined about the same time with the same kind of parents, kind of well-off parents, sending the kids away to, we wouldn't have this unbelievable band, So
no, and the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is what happened in the early 60s. Yeah. See, we were all born in 1950. So in 1965, we were 15. And you think about what's going on in 1963, 4, 5, the music scene is exploding.
That's right. Yeah.
It's all so exciting and so innovative. And to this day, everyone's listening to the music that was being produced then. It's funny, we're talking the day after Burt Bacharach died, and he's part of the story, the kind of the music that he was producing back then. Unbelievable songs with Hal David. So that was the context that this was going on in.
Yeah. The Led Zeppelin, the Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stone, the Genesis, they were way ahead of what was going on in United States at the time, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's unbelievable. So eventually you guys save enough money and book an hour at a recording studio called Tony Pike Sounds, right?
Oh, well, that was still in the days. That was when Anon. That was before Garden Wall, when Anon still existed. But it was 1966. It was earlier on. Yes, we saved up enough money for 1 hour, and I thought, wow, each song's only 3 or 4 minutes. We're going to get so much done in an hour. Of course, as you know, recording it's a very slow process.
That's right.
We managed to get one song done, which was a song Ant had written called Pennsylvania Flick House.
Yeah, which I think is in YouTube somewhere, right?
Which is on it's on Spotify. If anyone wants to listen to it, just put in Pennsylvania Flick House and you'll find it. And in fact, it has finally found its way on a release. Ant's done a big archive CD. And it's on there as well. So it has its place in history.
Yeah, I got it. I need to check that out. And you guys began getting gigs at Paris during the holiday,
right?
So,
just for friends and stuff. Yeah. And there were hops at school, and so we started to play live a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. What's the first impression that you got from you had from Peter Gabriel? He was different, I think, right? Or
Well, first of all, when that concert that we put on that was Anon and the Garden Wall, one of the things Peter had done is he designed a hat that looks not unlike what you Americans would recognize as a pilgrim's hat. If you're driving on I-90 in Massachusetts,
yep,
you see the hat. Well, it looks a bit like that one. And he had 100 of them made and went about selling them. So this concert was apart from anything else, it was a showcase for his hat because he wore it on stage and probably sold a few as a result. So, he was very shy. I hardly said 2 words to him while we were at Charterhouse, even though we were sort of, I would never say we were rivals. I didn't feel that we were rivals, and I didn't feel that I was ousted by him. I have read people saying that, but they're seeing too much in it because we had no choice, essentially. My parents decided to take me away from Charterhouse at the end of the summer of 1966. So that left the whole field open. So that was the end of it. But to be honest, I didn't get to know Peter until we moved into the cottage, which was 3 years later. That was the autumn of 1969. So we're jumping ahead a bit. All I just remember is he was quirky, eccentric, and very shy, and he still is.
Tony also is very shy as well. Why you think? And Steve Hackett also. What you think has something to do with parents in a way? The kids become more introvert or shy, or had nothing to do with it.
I don't know. No. It's too complex to go into. But the truth is that for whatever reason, these people were very creative and they needed an outlet. And that was a way of, it's not uncommon for actors who, go flat out on screen or in the theatre, or singers who do the same on stage. Off screen, they're quite shy. And this is the way they have found to express themselves
as an outlet to the Chinese to
a safe outlet.
Yeah. And then I read in your book that you mentioned that Tony Banks also, he was very, or he is still very shy, but he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he was.
Well, that's the thing. He's such a contrast. He's incredibly intelligent. And very clear, but has incredibly strong will. So, as you say, he knows exactly what he wants and what he doesn't want, and he is shy, but when it comes to it, he's not backward in saying what he wants. Yeah, so he's very strong-willed. Obviously, Peter is too. Yeah, and that stood them in very good stead. When in the early days, when, as we all know, it's not difficult. You've got a band and you're trying to break it, and especially early Genesis. They weren't a normal kind of band. They immediately you hear the early stuff and it's different. Yeah.
Before we go to the Christmas cottage, I suppose that all of them, like Peter and Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks, they have strong personality, and I suppose that there was clash, among themselves. And I think you mentioned in the book that if it wasn't for you, I think Mark Rutherford mentioned if it wasn't for you, that you were around in the house, the guys will have killed one another because, right? Or not literally. Probably.
It was a nice thing for him to say, but because this is like a crucible. One of the unusual things about Genesis is that they were all writers.
That's right, yeah.
Most bands, that's not the case. You look at this Lennon, McCartney, Jagger, Richards, one guy writes the songs and the other guy writes the words. and the other three just play what they're told, sort of thing. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but with Genesis, that wasn't the case. They were all coming up with ideas and bashing it out, and this is you. This is I'm expressing who I am, deep in my soul, and so I'm going to defend this, and also I don't want anybody playing it down. So it's bound to be a very highly strung and emotional process. And possibly I was some sort of brought some leveling influence to the proceedings, not consciously at the time, I have to say, but I can look back now, when I hear the others talking about what it was like for them and see the effect that I might have had on occasions. But Peter and Tony shared a room. I mean, I'm inevitably now moving towards the cottage, but when we were in the cottage, Peter and Tony shared a room, and it was only a small place. We were all piled on top of each other, but they both of them have said they were fine about that. It was never really a problem. There may have been a few moods here and there at the end of the day, but generally they got on fine.
Perfect. Yeah. Feel free to elaborate on who Jonathan King was and the first demo with 3 or 4 singles, that the band was able to put together and send it to him. What was the?
Well, there was a guy his passion was essentially recording and radio and stuff, and he went on to work for the BBC. So it was a perfect job for him. His name was Brian Roberts.
Yeah.
And he was a pal of Ant's. And the obvious thing is Brian wants to play at being a record producer or an engineer, and the band want to record. So, they made a demo tape. And another friend of ours, who's still a good friend of Mike's, called John Alexander, we always called him Al, and we still call him Al. He had the courage when Jonathan King came down to Charterhouse. He came down for a victory tour after he had a big hit with Everyone's Gone to the Moon. John approached him and gave him the tape, and he dutifully listened to it, and he said he thought there was definitely some writing talent there, but particularly he liked Peter's voice. So they ended up working with him. But he was for him, this was a departure of producing another band. And he didn't, apart from actually the music, playing and singing, he didn't really want that much input from them. So when they would make a recording, when it came to mixing it, he would throw them out of the studio, which drove them nuts. I can understand both points of view. But as you say, they did a few singles with him, Silent Sun and Winter's Tale, and they were both extremely good. Silent Sun especially, seriously could have been a hit. But I've always thought it would have been a disaster if it had been a hit, because it probably would have tied them in with Jonathan King, who definitely wanted he wanted to make pop singles. But also, I think success at that stage, where there were 17, would have been very damaging. And I think it all turned out for the best, very much.
Yeah, in many ways, I think I read somewhere that King noticed the band's tendency to expand and complicate arrangement, and he liked that stuff. He wanted to do like straightforward pop songs, 3-4 minutes, 3-4 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Genesis, they wanted, like I said, they wanted to do complicated arrangement, different chord changes before the mellotron, before they cut the mellotron, and that's what they became famous for. They were, as you say, they were many, very, very different too.
Well, that especially Tony Banks, because what drives him is harmony.
Yeah. And
the chords. Melody as well, obviously, but that's what he brought to the party. So that's inevitably the direction that they would have gone in.
And eventually they were able to record from Genesis to Revelation in March 1969 at Decca.
Yeah.
And I think from Decca point of view, they felt that was like a disappointment. I have listened to the record. Of course, I have a huge music collection, Richard, here in the house, and the album is not bad. I mean,
no, I know.
For now, 1923 is not bad. Maybe at the time, it was different for what the audience was waiting for, or the radio were playing. So it's bad or disappointment.
Yeah. The thing is that I think the record shows that Decca had seriously lost their way back then, because they famously turned down the Beatles.
That's right.
So, they didn't know their arse from their elbow, frankly. So when something like Genesis comes along, even the Jonathan King version of Genesis, they did not know what to do with it. But ultimately, as I say, I think it worked out for the best, because if that had been a big hit, I think things would have been very different.
Yeah, looking back, that was, and then also Jonathan King got in all kind of trouble with the law and stuff that I don't want to mention here, but in a way that was.
Yeah, you can look it up on the internet.
Yeah, thanks God that things went different way, and Genesis wasn't labeled like a pop band, right? Because then we wouldn't have the Genesis that we know nowadays. So
no,
yeah, and then so Genesis moved to the Christmas cottage. Feel free to elaborate.
Well, yeah, while the Jonathan King thing was all going on,
yeah,
I went to Israel to work on a kibbutz.
Yeah,
and as I waited for 6 months, and I came back in the summer of 1969. I mean, they carried on rehearsing and writing. They were just moving forward, and they were planning to go to college. Peter was going to go to film school. God knows what the movies he would have produced would have been like, but we shall never know. So I went down they were at Anne's house outside Guildford, and things had really moved on. And I sat down and they played me 2 or 3 songs they were working on at the time. And I thought, wow, this is, and I suppose you could say at that point I fell in love with them, and they became my vocation. And amazingly coincidentally, my parents had a cottage that they were going to sell the following spring. And I said, can we use it for the winter? And amazingly, they said yes. So my dad used to work for a bread company. He got us an old bread van. And so we had a cottage and a van. So that's when, as Mike Rutherford puts it very well, he said, at the cottage we became a band. So it was a special time. So we moved in I think October 69, and we were there for 4 or 5 months. And every day would be writing and rehearsing. And then Peter and I would be on the phone trying to get gigs, and, things started to happen. And then early in 1970, we met Tony Stratton Smith of Charisma.
Yep.
And he signed the band, and we left the cottage. And what happened at the cottage basically was Trespass. That was the album that they wrote, created. And so we left the cottage, moved to London, went on a wage. Suddenly we were able to buy better equipment, and, the whole thing, machine started to roll under the auspices of the great Strat, as he was known, Tony Stratton Smith. Yeah.
Although you mentioned that, although you didn't become a doctor or a lawyer or a politician, your parents still like you enough to, let you do your thing and let the house and the band. So you have loving parents,
I know. There was some degree of acceptance from them, I suppose, that this is what I wanted to do.
That's right. The rock and roll in this kid is not going away. So we better help him,
Well,
because
yeah,
that's
probably
going to be his life,
to their deathbeds. They wished that it had gone away, but it didn't. So they did. It was an incredible gift for them to lend us the cottage and get a van.
Yeah.
And it was a career for me for as long as I wanted it to be.